unfortunately, state agencies have measured the health of wildlife on the basis of the absolute number of a handful of game species such as deer and elk and wild turkeys. If one looks at the broad range of species and how they're faring, it's not well, not in Iowa, not in the east, not in the west, not in the south. And as I said before, it's not just hunting, it's all the ways in which humans pillage this planet, and certainly our food consumption habits and animal agriculture are a devastating impact.
Hello, Mr. Casella. Is that right? You mentioned that hunting was not needed for deer control. I guess I'd focus on that. Being a native of Illinois, I know of 2 cases of 4,000-acre second home development where professional hunters were called in to depopulate the deer population. It was 3-fold carrying capacity, and it's the second highest kill county in the state. In addition, a park near Rockford had to have professional killers come in and again remove the population and bring it down into an acceptable level. Both of those were done, the one at the park was done with high-powered rifles, and the one done at the second home development was done with the traditional hunting equipment in that state, which is with the slug gun. Just curious, what is your alternative to that when I even live in that county or have residents in that county and hunt quite actively to try to maintain the population on the ground that is open for hunting? Both of those places are no hunting areas. Thank you.
The Bible of the deer manager is Whitetail Deer Management and Ecology. It's a basic text. And in it, the authors who come from many state agencies and throughout federal agencies point out that there is no absolute need to hunt deer to keep them within the biological carrying capacity of the system. The more relevant question, and I would argue that natural decimating factors limit deer numbers, the more relevant question is the cultural carrying capacity. How many deer will people tolerate? In a state like Iowa with agriculture, certainly the number of deer that they'll tolerate is not very high in certain areas of the state. So the question is, how many deer will we tolerate? I don't think that hunting from an environmental perspective is needed for any species. The question is, do we need it for certain cultures, certain attitudes, because certain economic practices are going on? I think a DNR management program that's designed to keep deer numbers high to provide recreational shooting opportunities is in conflict with a policy to limit numbers. And if we were trying to limit numbers, we'd be doing things very differently. We wouldn't be using inefficient hunting tools like bows and arrows. We wouldn't be shooting any males, and we certainly wouldn't be manipulating any habitat, and we would be restoring native prairies, which are not very favorable habitat types for deer populations.
Thank you. I have a question for Mr. Caselli. I'm living with a problem at the moment, and then I'll ask you a question how to solve this problem. I'm living on a 2-acre pond. We have exactly 28 mature oaks. By mature, I'm talking 40 to 100 years old. State foresters have come out and looked at these trees. 28. We have a terrible beaver problem on this pond at the moment. There are 10 of these mature oaks up to 100 years old that are completely girdled. That means they're dead or dying. We have 10 of them that show 20 to 75% damage. Out of this population of 28 giant oaks, we actually have only 8 of them that show, as of yet, no damage. How do we solve that problem with no trapping? And if there's a solution as far as live trapping or something like that, who's to pay for this?
Well, fortunately, we have a biologist on our staff who's a beaver expert, and we respond to beaver complaints all the time. In fact, we responded to one here at Iowa State University a couple of years ago. If one has a specific number of trees to be protected, the best deterrent to that is to protect the trees through some type of fencing, which is the most efficient way. And occasionally, if someone wants a more permanent structure, even a concrete structure might work. In Colorado, in cooperation with the Division of Wildlife, a sterilization program is going on which would limit the long-term. You laugh, but the Division of Wildlife is conducting the program, and for particular areas in which there are high beaver densities, that has proved to be the most socially acceptable way to regulate beaver numbers. So, there are a battery of alternatives, and we have a document called Living with Beavers that shows how to install dam flumes and beaver bafflers and how to protect individual trees through a compendium of alternatives. And sterilization is an emerging technology which is now being used, as I said, by the Colorado Division of Wildlife.
I have a two-part question. The first part, the question for Mr. Bishop, and the second part for Mr. Pacelli. My question for Mr. Bishop is, every Iowa hunter is required to pay $5 for a wildlife habitat stamp. I'd like to know how much of that money goes directly for wildlife habitat.
100% of it goes to wildlife, the purchase of wildlife habitat.
The second part of my question is for Mr. Pacelli. I'd like to know, since you opened the issue of salaries, etc., what is your organization's annual budget? How much of that annual budget goes directly to animal welfare, such as habitat, animal shelters, etc.? How much goes to public relations, administrative costs, anti-hunting, anti-farming campaigns?
We have a $2 million budget roughly, and we maintain 3 animal facilities. We have a large wildlife rehabilitation center in Southern California where we take raptors that have been shot or hit by vehicles, or coyotes or bobcats or a number of species. And last year we released more than 1,000 animals back into the wild. We have a large animal facility in Central Texas, and we have a small animal facility in South Carolina. That represents about 1/4 of our budget. We don't do direct habitat purchases. We choose to lobby. One instance is the California Proposition 117 in 1990. That measure had 2 elements. One, it sought to permanently ban mountain lion hunting, and 2, it sought to use existing or some non-traditional sources to devote $30 million annually for each of the next 30 years to acquire habitat for threatened and endangered species, and also deer and mountain lions. Even though the NRA and other hunting groups opposed it, that measure passed, and that's a $900 million habitat proposal.
Wayne, my question is for you. In order to keep cats and dogs under control and controllable numbers, humane groups such as yours, as well as a lot of other humane groups, daily kills cats and dogs, all the excess daily. What if the humane groups can't keep control of animals without killing them, like cats and dogs? How do you expect wildlife populations to be kept under control if we can't trim them?
Ungulate populations came to what we now call the North American continent about 1 million years ago, as far as we can tell from the geologic records. Humans probably came 20 or 30,000 years ago. Almost all animal species evolved in the absence of significant human predation. At some point along the line, probably 10,000 years ago, humans domesticated animals. We put them into our environments. We tampered with their reproductive abilities. We tampered with their genetics. Dogs and cats can't survive out in the wild in any reliable way, like those species that have been fine-tuned by natural selection over eons. The humane societies that kill dogs and cats do it with regret. They do it because people have failed in their responsibilities to care for them. And finally, after they're done, they don't mount the heads on the wall. And I think that's a very important distinction.
Thank you. I'd like to address my question to both speakers, and I'd like to first thank you both for coming. And my question really is this. First of all, Mr. Pacelli, is that correct? Did you give a statistic earlier on the number of hunters and non-hunters?
Yes, I did. I gave a national figure as the source is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service every 5-year survey.
And what was that statistic?
There are 15.8 million licensed hunters according to the 1985, which is the most recent survey that's been done. And one factor is the adult population. That's between 7 and 8% of the above 16 population in the U.S.
Well, then my question is this. It would, and I guess I have to preface it by a little bit of a statement. As I understand your point of view, and really Mr. Bishop's point of view, we're all concerned about animals and their preservation. Wouldn't it be better if those statistics were reversed? That is to say, wouldn't it be better if 98% of this population hunted? That way we have 98% of the people interested in having animals around, and 98% of the people putting money into having animals around, 98% of the people... Well, I don't think I need to go on.
I'd like to, would you like to go first?
Go ahead.
Okay. I would like to debunk the myth that somehow hunter dollars are supporting wildlife populations across this country and wild lands across this country. This country is constituted of 2 billion acres. 700 million acres are in federal hands. The Bureau of Land Management is 270 million acres, and hunters didn't pay for any of those BLM lands, and the maintenance of those lands is paid for by general tax dollars.
Cattle farmers.
191 million acres is managed by the U.S. Forest Service, and hunter dollars didn't go to the purchase nor to the maintenance of those lands. The National Park Service is 80 million acres, and no specific hunter dollars have gone for their acquisition nor their maintenance. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service National Wildlife Refuge System is 90 million acres, and duck stamps have paid for 3.5 million of those 90 million acres, about 4% of the total. Then there are Department of Defense lands and other lands. At the state level, there are state forests and state parks. The only state lands that are paid for are $500, one might argue, are Pittman-Robertson Act funds, although now more than half of gun purchasers are non-hunters. 4 million acres have been paid for at the state level, that's wildlife management rates, and some hunter dollars have gone to acquisition of certain habitat. If one is generous, one might say that hunters have helped pay for about 20 million acres of land in this country. 20 million. Now, I challenge anyone to dispute that, whether it's the specific Pittman-Robertson funds, Ducks Unlimited purchases, hunter license contributions to the state agencies. It's 2 billion acres. If being generous, 25 million acres is somehow doing the trick for wildlife, then there's some miracle going on.
Mr. Bishop.
The only thing I might say to that is that sportsmen are certainly taxpayers of this country, and we have paid through our revenue just as well as anyone else to protect national parks, protect those lands in BLM and Forest Service land. I don't think that I can be separated out as not being part of that. I think the point is that on top of all that federal land that was put aside, basically not by any major group, but a general societal feeling of protecting the land for wildlife and scenic values for all people. But sportsmen are contributing on top of that. And I think that's the point that has been made. And we're spending $360 billion by Fish and Game agencies on wildlife management. And I feel that is all on top of that. And yes, I would defend that. A lot of these dollars are going into the protection of habitat. Not all of them. A lot of them are going into salaries, granted. But a lot of them are going into research that better all of wildlife species.
Pacelli, in the interest of keeping this discussion factual and as professional as possible, as was said initially, I'm not exactly sure which are several questions that need to be cleared up. Several things that apparently misstatements on your part. One is that your degree is in environmental science from Yale. According to what I've read in the literature, which may be wrong, that degree is actually in history. Also, the Gallup poll being refuted, actually the Gallup organization felt it necessary to come out after a lot of propaganda put out by the animal rights groups and has since put its full weight of its organization behind the National Shooting Sports Foundation poll, completely saying that that is very professionally done. But what I want to ask you about is this National Park Service model that you think is such a tremendous way of managing wildlife. How do you relate to the fact then that bison have to be controlled now in Yellowstone? The elk historically have had overgrazing problems in Yellowstone and are actually controlled by hunting off of the park. If they didn't migrate off the park, there'd be significant problems. Also in Catoctin National Park in Maryland, they're considering having their first deer hunt ever held in a national park because these National Park Service biologists that you put on the pedestal can find no other alternative to hunting to control deer in that park. And there's a survey going out around the Park Service right now, just been completed, showing that a number of other national parks are expecting to have hunts. How would you clarify some of those points for us, please?
Well, first, I had twin tracks in college, and one of my majors was, in fact, Western history, and the other was a major called Studies in the Environment. The National Shooting Sports Foundation Gallup poll, you claim that it was pressure from animal rights groups. It was Alex Gallup, president of that organization, who renounced the poll, and we've got his statement on record, and I don't have it with me, but I'd be happy to send it to you for clarification. Regarding bison and elk in Yellowstone National Park, bison, perhaps a symbol of human persecution of wildlife, ranging in numbers at one time, 16th or 17th century, from 40 to 60 million to 14 free-roaming animals surviving in Yellowstone at the turn of the century. They built their numbers up to 2,500 by the mid-1980s and three subpopulations in the park: the northern herd, the Merry Mountain herd, and the Pelican herd. And the northern herd is at the northern range of the park. It's a 2.2 million acre park, 2,500 bison. Not aware of any of the park biologists who are saying that bison are overpopulated in that park. It's a very low density of bison. The reason that they migrate out of the park is not for food scarcity in the park, but because they're gregarious animals. They learn that there are existing rangelands outside the park. And Yellowstone's boundaries were drawn in 1872. The word ecology was coined in 1866. It's a square. And the Yellowstone ecosystem is much larger than Yellowstone National Park. And they wander outside of the park and they're gunned down because of, in my view, an irrational concern about their transmitting brucellosis to cattle. Again, wild animals, the last free-roaming herd in this country, is being subjected to large-scale shooting because of domestic agriculture. So, and elk haven't been shot in Yellowstone in 30 years, and their numbers cycle just like all other ungulate populations. They're not steady state as the game managers would like. They fluctuate up and down, but natural factors are limiting their numbers, and I'm confident that will continue.
Wayne, would you mind if I
No, not at all.
responded to that too? I had been back in 1964 and 65. I happened to work for the Montana Game and Fish Department. I happened to be part of that program outside of Yellowstone Park. And elk at that time were not overutilizing their summer range, but they were definitely overutilizing, overbrowsing the winter range. There was no browsing left. Those animals were coming out of the park. We were forced into hay lifting, bales of hay, 2 elk coming out of that park, and we sit there and watched them starve to death. And I'll tell you what, that would never be erased from my game management mind. I'll tell you that. We watched animals stumble around. We fed them full of hay. Their stomachs were not key. The biota in their stomachs were not key to digest the hay because it would have been mostly on the browse. We did watch those elk die by the hundreds, and that was not a pretty sight. I'd far rather accept the fact of shooting those animals when they come out. And we did happen to do that, and that's still a practice that's needed.
May I? I accept the fact that certain animals die in systems. Life is part of death, and I accept that. Those elk that die of starvation provide essential winter food for black bears and grizzly bears and coyotes and smaller mammals, raptors. That's part of an ecological system. And at some points in a cycle, elk might die, 10%, 15% of them as a consequence of food scarcity. But that's not an ecological problem, and it certainly takes the weak, the sick, the infirm, those that aren't the best competitors in the long term strengthening the genetics of a population. Whereas hunting, as some biologists have called, is evolution in reverse, because many hunters, and I've seen them kill the bison and the elk outside the park, select the biggest and the best animals.
Mr. Pacelli, if we end animal husbandry because we inflict pain to these sentient non-humans, would this not lead to genocide of the cow, the dog, the cat, and animals like the California condor?
I don't understand the point about the California condor. It's a native species.
Right now it's domestic. It's not in the outdoors.
Well, I think that it's in captivity. To call it domestic is another matter. And there are captive breeding programs that we think are appropriate to restore native species. We have tampered with the precursors of cows, precursors of chickens like the wild jungle fowl. There's nothing to me magical about retaining the genes of those species, and I certainly don't have any ludicrous notion of turning these animals out back into the wild or something. We would like to see a slow phase out of those animals if we want to keep some of them around to preserve their genetics, and if they're kept in a hospitable and humane environment, I wouldn't have any problem with that, but I certainly wouldn't call it genocide. I'd call it environmental responsibility, and I'd call it a strong step towards stopping enormous cruelty perpetrated against sentient mammals.
Mr. Pacelli, you prefer natural mortality. Today's farmers in Iowa are farming right up to the fence line, in the process leaving no extra habitat than necessary. Regardless of farming practices, why do you prefer the natural mortality of the starving and frozen pheasants due to lack of food and cover, rather than being utilized by a hunter?
Pheasants are not native to Iowa, nor to Connecticut, nor to California. They're native to China. They were brought here in the late 19th century. In fact, they compete with native upland birds like prairie chickens and have a deleterious impact on the environment. But no one argues that the million pheasants that are shot in Iowa annually necessarily impacting their population one way or the other. We argue that the pressures that they face in the wild are added to the pressures that they're facing from sport hunters, and we consider it gratuitous shooting and gratuitous harm to those animals.
I have a question for both of you. To me, one of the greatest things in America is the fact that you can own private property, and I realize that economic utilization of the tremendous resource in Iowa and America is very important. But yet, both of you have expressed concern about that mismanagement or possible mismanagement. What is your proposal to accomplish your goals yet allow for the economic activity of agriculture?
I believe in agriculture, and I think that it certainly has a place. I think that the best strategy for agriculture is to produce food for the people that need it, but to do it in an ecologically sustainable way. I'm not against capitalism, I'm not against private property, I'm not against agriculture. I think it's important to have its place, and I think that an animal-based agriculture system is wasteful of resources, and it mines our soils, it mines our waterways, pollutes the environment, and I think it's unsustainable in the long run.
I feel that both wildlife programs and agriculture can coincide and both prosper. I think that's been demonstrated in several areas of the state, especially with this last farm program that developed this Conservation Reserve Program. This has shown us that really we're overproducing, and we're overproducing agricultural crops, and the prices are down. And it doesn't make for the best return on your investment. But the farm program has paid farmers to seed that land down to grassland. And that has been beneficial to a lot of wildlife species. And we are seeing right now in some parts of our state, we have over 2 million acres seeded down in the state today under the CRP. And yes, agriculture and wildlife programs are coinciding. There are compromises to be made. And the deer population is one that we're going to compromise on. We're not going to eliminate deer populations because they eat corn. But neither are we going to let that deer population go rampant to the point that it drastically impacts farmers' income or decimates its own habitat through some of the vegetation in parks or other areas that's set aside in the state. Nor are we going to probably tolerate large deer populations in urban areas where the public is becoming very upset. But yes, I think we can manage agriculture and wildlife at the same time for the benefit of both.
We have time for one more quick question.
My question is for Mr. Pacelli, and it deals with bow hunting. I know it's not in the news very much, but I was wondering, you keep claiming the 50% figure of deer hit with an arrow, 1 out of every 2 dies in the land. And I was wondering, how did you come about this figure? If you could clarify that. And you said it was tests were conducted by your organization at your facilities, and how can that be unbiased?
Well, I hope I didn't mislead anyone, and I hope I didn't misspeak. No tests regarding bow hunting were conducted in any of our facilities. We have done a pretty exhaustive review of the existing literature about bow hunting, and there's not much sound scientific information on it. There seems to be, the best we have is general survey information, like the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department survey on 3 wildlife management areas in the state of Texas. And Glenn Boydston and Horace Gore, 2 wildlife biologists, that state agency, with these extensive surveys, concluded that the crippling rate, the number of animals, the percentage of animals lost and not retrieved, was about 50%. That's consistent with about 20 other surveys and partial studies that we have compiled. My point about bow hunting is that if there is an ethic that calls for the quickest, cleanest kill, why would we use a hunting tool that doesn't reliably and efficiently kill animals? And certainly it's not a relatively efficient killer compared to shotguns and rifles.
Okay, now we'll have 5-minute closing remarks, beginning with Mr. Bishop.
I'd like to address one thing that brought up, is that the trapping of eagles. There were 4 eagles trapped in Iowa last year. All of those are still alive. In fact, we're going to release one of them tomorrow. None of them died as a result of trapping. The one trapper that did catch 2 of them realized that his trapping method was taking eagles. He sprung all his traps, took all his bait away, called the conservation officer. They took the eagles in. That was a very responsible trapper, and things that we're proud of when we see this type of activity. But may I remind you that it seemed in the paper the other day that was a kind of a negative thing, but to me I'm very pleased for some of what those statistics show. Since 1983, the wintering eagle population in Iowa was 323. In 1991, it was 642. That's a 98% increase in eagles. And yes, we're going to see more eagles get into traps, even if we completely eliminate exposed bait. We're going to have 6 of those eagles were not trapped. One of them was caught in a fence and had to be destroyed. Another had legs broken, they had a wire or something else. We're going to have accidents in these wildlife populations. And as our eagle population expands, which shows very good wildlife management, yes, we are looking at birds that we do not hunt. And we're all proud in the Natural Resources Department of this Eagle camp. So anyway, to get on with that, I'd like just to summarize a number of points this evening. First of all, I believe hunting is a tool of scientific management. I don't think we need to make excuses or do anything but acknowledge that it's a very viable tool of wildlife management. And wildlife management is focused around animal welfare. And professional biologists, as I have stated, I feel are good examples of animal welfare. They work long and hard hours to provide ideal habitat for both hunted and non-hunted species. Managing wildlife populations through hunting and the use of animals for food are both reasonable uses of animals. Licensed fees from hunters and trappers are used to protect portions of all major habitat types that benefit all wildlife species common diet. We are providing and protecting all of those basic habitat types. If it were not for these dollars, many of these areas would not be in existence. It would not be providing thick timber cover that may provide nesting habitat for red-shouldered hawks or scarlet tanagers. Loss of habitat is the biggest factor that impacts or threatens any wildlife species today. The DNR manages over 300,000 acres of wildlife habitat for the well-being of all wildlife. These areas are used by bird watchers, by hikers, by photographers, by educators, and for ecological study, as well as hunting and wildlife viewing. So they provide a broad environmental opportunity for people. And I think hunting is humane. Alternatives to manage wild populations are the natural way. I feel that if you're talking about humaneness, hunting is not more inhumane than the natural way. The natural way is pretty harsh and cruel. Mother Nature is not too nice. Animals that live have to die, and the major question is the manner of death. Most of us do not like that, but it's still a fact of life that we cannot get away from. Small game populations are going to perish. The majority of those animals are going to perish within a year, regardless of hunting or non-hunting. If we compare hunting and game management to no hunting or game management, wildlife is far better off having professionals and hunters fighting to protect their habitat and their future well-being. We must remember that animal rights people do not concern themselves with the quality of life or animal welfare. Just as long as man does not kill these animals for food or recreation, it's all right. The natural way is okay. Painful death is accepted as long as man is not involved. They favor no pets, no animal husbandry, no use of animals for medical research, even if it benefits humans. This is a policy judgment on the way people live. Not just hunting. We're talking about basic philosophy. These people are pressing their minority views on the majority of society without the benefit of logic or scientific facts.
Mother Nature doesn't stop just because hunting is permitted. Hunting adds to what already goes on in Mother Nature. I don't say that we can ever create a world where there's no pain and suffering for non-human animals who certainly feel pain in a fundamentally similar way to you and I and the rest of us here. What I'm saying is that human beings have the capacity for choice, and that we should exercise a responsible choice and try to minimize the suffering that human beings create and perpetuate. Hunting claims 200 million animals a year. It's no longer necessary. It's a recreational activity. It was a Supreme Court justice who once said, "Your right to swing your arm ends where the other person's nose begins. I very much believe that people can discharge firearms and recreate in so many ways, but the problem is when that recreation impacts another, then that person doesn't have all-encompassing choice. And yes, I do want to stop choice. I want to stop black bear hunters from shooting bears out of trees or mountain lions out of trees. I want to stop duck hunters from shooting 10 million a year when their numbers are declining. I want to stop 15 or 20 doves from being shot by 2 million hunters every year. I want to stop so many of these things that we do to animals in the name of recreation. And our society has already done it in some respects. We've stopped dog fighting. We've stopped cockfighting. It's a logical progression to look to other ways in which we recreationally kill and harm animals. The next logical area that we should look at is the recreational killing of wildlife, whether it's hunting or whether it's trapping. And yes, there were 4 eagles reported, and I'm certainly glad to hear that those eagles, or at least one of those eagles, is on the mend. I hope the others are. How many other eagles were trapped and not reported? Trapping has no basis in biology. It's randomly done. Trapping pressure is more motivated, as I said earlier, on the basis of pelt prices than sound biology. Let's not delude ourselves and think that we somehow know how to manage the wild animal populations of this world precisely through hunting activity. State wildlife agencies are in the business of providing service to hunters and trappers, not in the business of protecting natural diversity, not in the business of protecting wildlife. Sarah Vickerman of Defenders of Wildlife did a study of state game and fish agencies and pointed out that more than 90% of the dollars go to game species projects. They go to hunter education, to the construction of shooting ranges, to law enforcement to keep hunting and trapping regulations enforced, to game species research. Very little money goes to non-game species, which represent the vast majority of those species. And indeed, hunters pay for licenses and have paid for licenses, and those contributions have been important. We need a new system of management. We don't need to have wildlife management by gunpoint necessarily. We can have a much better and a much broader wildlife system. And the basic value question here, and it shouldn't be confused with biology, is that animals are dying because we want to shoot them for recreational purposes. And they're suffering because we want to shoot them for recreational purposes. I don't think that's justifiable, and I don't think that people who have empathy for other creatures think that's justifiable.
I'd like to thank Mr. Bishop and Mr. Pacelli for being with us this evening, and I'd like to thank all of you for attending this rather interesting debate. Thank you.